This is Legal Principles of Surveying, Spring 2014 online, East Central Community College in Decatur, Mississippi. My name is Chris Riles and I'm your instructor. And we're going to cover Chapter 2 now. We covered the finishing part of Chapter 1 and now we're going to cover Chapter 2 of the textbook, talking about creation of boundaries. Now, we need to start off with thinking about what is a line. When we talk about lines in surveying, they divide interest in real property. And as we taught before, real property is basically land that can be owned by someone. And so the interest that we're talking about in this land that can be owned is, what can I do with it? What are my rights to the land? What is the extent of what I can do with my land? It is a mathematical line and it's invisible without any breadth. So basically the concept is, I have a line here that's mathematically computated, but it's not really there on the ground. When we survey a line, we don't paint a line on the ground to follow the boundary line. And so because of that, lines have three components that we use to recreate the line, to reshow the line. And the first is a corner, second is direction, and the third is distance. Now, the term corner and monument are sometimes used as the same thing, but they are not the same thing. A corner is defined as a vertex or node on a map, and that's really important to know that it's based on it being on a map. Corners are not physical in nature, but a representation of an intersection of boundary lines on a plat or a map. So if you see a corner on a map, you're seeing the intersection of two lines, and that creates a vertex. A monument, on the other hand, are physical markings which show the location of a corner on the ground. Monuments can be many different types of things. I've seen all different types of monuments throughout my career. You'll see monuments that look, I've seen bed rails, I've seen iron pipes, I've seen concrete monuments. So this picture here is in Kemper County, Mississippi, and we found the southwest corner of section 28, and it's located here on this topographical map. As you can see, the arrow is pointing to the intersection of two section lines, and this is a corner of four sections, and we're looking at the southwest corner of section 28. This is a corner. This is the monument for the corner. So if you'll notice, there's a concrete monument here. The concrete monument has a brass plate in the top with a dimple, and that dimple that's circled there, that dimple is the actual location of the section corner, and that dimple was created so that we would all know where the corner is and where to survey from. So that's really important. It also tells us, if we look at this as a section, if you look at the yellow square as a section, that this is the southwest corner of the section. So it's pretty powerful evidence here. We also found an iron rod next to it, but we'll talk about that iron rod in just a minute. Important information about boundaries. Once boundary lines are defined and monumented, they're considered to be legally existent, which basically means as soon as you put the lines on the ground with corners and monumentation, the lines cannot be changed by the surveyor or by the courts. Now the reason that is because we don't want to change other people's property lines and boundary lines. That's just not really part of what we do. We're there to find evidence and to place monumentation. However, the landowner can change these boundary lines through a process pursuing one of the four general statutes of agreement, estoppel, acquiescence, and adverse possession. Now, we'll talk about these at length throughout the course. We'll talk about them a little bit in this part of the course, but we'll talk about them at greater length as we progress in the course. The one that you're probably most familiar with is adverse possession if you've done any real estate law or any law research. And it's a general statute that is very ambiguous in a lot of cases, so don't get your hopes up that you're going to adversely possess some land. Creating, changing, and identifying boundaries. Neither the student nor the surveyor should confuse the distinction between the creation of the boundaries and that of changing boundaries already created. It's extremely important that you don't go into the surveying profession believing that you're changing boundaries. It is important to note that changing a boundary is legal in nature. And that is probably one of the most profound statements in the textbook, where it talks about you can't change a boundary unless you have a legal precedent or a legal purpose to change that boundary. It's primarily governed by the courts to change a boundary. For example, If there's an agreement between two individuals that the boundary is not in the right place, the court will decide then to change the boundary. But it's not the surveyor that decides. While the creation of the new boundary is based on both past and present evidence and can be done by the surveyor. So when you create a boundary, that's surveyor approved. When you change a boundary, that's court approved only. You cannot go and change a boundary as a surveyor. And this distinction is vital to how this is seen in law. All of your court cases, the precedent is a changing of a boundary cannot be performed by a surveyor, period. And of the identifying and location of the boundary that was to be retraced. The surveyor is responsible for retracement, and it's based on past and current observations. All the evidence you can find is really what it's focused on. And many, if not all of your surveys, you will involve retracing the steps of surveyors before you. There are very few people that will today be able to create an original boundary because much of the United States is being surveyed. It's not until some person places a physical object, the monument at the point or corner, does the point become identifiable and retraceable. Without a monument, corners are purely defined by writings or law. Remember, we talked about there was action, writings, and law in processes that we could create a boundary. Well, retracement of these boundaries is extremely important, and without monuments or corners to define where that boundary is, we're kind of left up to chance on locating the boundary. So retracement involves a lot of research, not only in the courthouse but also out in the field. So from your textbook, there are 7 principles of boundary creation in Chapter 2. Principle 1 is a landowner may divide a parcel of land in any manner not inconsistent with the law, and we call it lex loci with the local law, and that's really important to remember there. Principle 2, once a boundary or boundaries is created, no alterations or modifications are permitted in any manner by either the landowner or any surveyor once property rights have been granted or distributed according to the boundaries created. And we'll talk about that more in depth in just a few minutes. The original surveyor creates boundaries. It is the retracing surveyor who ascertains or identifies boundaries from original evidence. That's a very important principle, number 3. Number 4, once created and approved, the original boundaries are legally without error and are the exact dimensions as indicated by the creating surveyor. Principle 5, no surveyor or court has legal authority to alter or modify a boundary once it is created. It can be interpreted only from the evidence of where the boundary is located. And Principle 6, a retracing surveyor relates to previously created and recovered evidence to a current survey, being mindful that the current survey is always subject to collateral attack by other surveyors. And then finally, Principle 7, a modern surveyor may describe bearings and distances to a greater degree of precision using modern technology. We're going to talk about all of these as we go throughout this lecture. A word about creation of boundaries by survey. The amount of integrity and knowledge to perform a retracement survey and boundary creation survey are very different. A retracement survey, if I'm just retracing something, I'm basically walking through the motions of what someone else did and identifying on a map what they have done. And that's not as difficult or requires the same amount of knowledge as then a boundary creation survey. Being legally capable is not the same as being technically capable. And this is a fundamental truth in our profession. Just because you have the legal capability to perform boundary creation does not mean you have the knowledge to perform that survey to minimum standards, nor does that mean that you have the experience to understand how to create boundaries and how to set boundaries. This course alone does not give you the ability to complete knowledge to perform a boundary creation survey. We are merely talking about the law. What you learn in this class is an overview of the law. You should really look at the law of your state and look more specifically at the law pertaining to boundary creation before you just go out and create a boundary. And also, all of you know, I hope, that you cannot perform a survey without a license in the state of Mississippi. And so, without doing that, if you perform a survey without a license or without being under a licensed surveyor, you are subject to being arrested and subject to being tried in court for falsely identifying boundaries. And the same applies here. The amount of knowledge and integrity you need to set boundaries on the ground is much greater than a general knowledge of surveying. That's really what I want to get at right here at this part of the lecture. And you're going to excuse me, I have a little bit of sinus drainage. Alright, instances of boundary creation. Boundaries can be created by action, writings, and law. If you'll remember that, according to that first principle, landowners can divide their parcel in any way they want as long as the law is observed. Now, this could be conceived to be a constitutional right, and in many cases, looking at the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, we see where this is almost a constitutional right of the landowner to divide their parcel in any way they want, as long as the law is observed. So the landowner can split their parcel up into multiple pieces using a fence. This would be by action they are creating these boundaries, but the boundary is not necessarily the extent of anyone's particular ownership of the land, and when they sell the land, it becomes a little bit different. Subdivision of their lands could be for purposes of sale, gifts, or inheritance. Typically, the landowner has a predetermined idea of how they want to subdivide the land. If you're hired as a surveyor to go out on a piece of property and subdivide that land, typically the landowner will tell you, yes, I want to do this, or I want to cut it up into 8 pieces or 12 pieces. They'll typically tell you how to do that. However, it is the job of the surveyor to create these new boundaries in a way that would be consistent with standardized surveying methods and local law. It's not your job to just do what the client wants. It's your job to follow the law, because that's what you're licensed for, is to follow and uphold surveying standards and surveying law in the state that you're licensed in. In some states, landowners are actually allowed to conduct their own survey and to place monuments along their boundaries without the use of a professional surveyor. There are several states, as I've researched and read. I think Oregon is one. Most of your western states are that way. Mississippi is not one of these. You cannot just go out and set monuments on the ground and create your own boundaries without a professional surveyor. All boundary work is to be conducted by a professionally licensed surveyor. And if you're not a professionally licensed surveyor, or you're not working under a professionally licensed surveyor, then you are working outside of the law. As a surveyor, especially in the state of Mississippi, you should really discourage this mentality. There are a lot of individuals who believe they can just go out and set whatever monumentation and corners they want to set. Even though in a short-term self-survey may seem to save money, legal actions and litigation can cost the landowner a great deal of money. There are some instances that I have seen where individuals have set their own corners and set their own boundaries and sold land and moved land and gave land to people. But then when they come back later, when a surveyor tries to retrace what happened on the property, it's more difficult to retrace once something like this has happened, because there's no evidence surveying based to really define the boundaries. And though the boundaries may have been defined, they weren't defined to a legal standard, and so that can cause some serious issues when trying to retrace that survey. Alright, principle number 2. Once a boundary or boundaries are created, no alterations or modifications are permitted in any manner by either the landowner or any surveyor once property rights have been granted and distributed according to the boundaries created. So we have a situation between two landowners. Let's say we got landowners A and B. A owns the land, and A decides to subdivide his land into 2 pieces. He sells one of the pieces to landowner B. So now landowner A, once he's sold this land to B, he cannot change the boundary location, because what he's done is he has sold the property to B. If he moved the boundary location, it would now infringe on the rights of B. However, as long as A owns both pieces, he can move the boundary as much as he wants. He could say, well, I really don't want it to be, half. I want it to be 2/3 mine and 1/3 yours. And he can do that as long as he hasn't conveyed or sold the property to anyone else. But once he's sold it or conveyed it, he's then infringing on their common right law of use of the land. And so that's really important to understand, that once a boundary is created, and once property rights have been granted, nobody can change it. It's the way it is. And so you have to be very careful with that when you're buying and selling land. Now, boundary principle 3 talks about retracements. We may have beat this into ground, but once again, I just want to hit this up one more time. Original surveyors create boundaries. Retracing surveyors identify the location of these boundaries. And evidence is the key of a retracement survey to perform an ethical and moral representation of the boundary lines. The less research and time you spend on gathering evidence, the more likely you are to have an error of some sort in the survey. Or you may have to go back and fix something that you messed up on the survey. Okay? But remember, once you create these boundaries and set them in the ground, they are there. And really you should be concerned when you set boundary corners in the ground to make sure they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Principle 4, it should be understood that an original survey was the first survey to define boundaries. In many cases, these surveys are performed by the General Land Office. Once these have been approved, they stand as the legal definition of these boundaries and are considered to be unchangeable. Remember Cragen versus Powell? I talked about that earlier in, I think, in the previous lecture. You can go to this link and follow this link to the website and read about Cragen versus Powell. The precedent in this case is that once a land line has been set by the federal government, it cannot be changed. This is a precedent that has been going around since the 1800s, and so you really have to remember that an original survey is an unchangeable survey. It's one that we cannot move, cannot adjust. Even with the modern technology we have today, we cannot fix it, because once it's created, it's unchangeable. Principle 5, no surveyor or court has the legal authority to alter or modify a boundary line once created. It can be interpreted only from evidence of where the boundary is located. Remember, once boundaries are created and rights are conveyed, that they are considered unchangeable. Remember we talked about that just a few minutes ago? This protects the rights of adjacent landowners. This means that even if you find an error, you do not have the right, legal authority of any kind, even as a surveyor, to change the boundaries, because this affects all of the landowners. I want you to think with me for just a minute. Let's say that there's a corner that was set with a concrete monument that was the section corner for an area. Well, that section corner affects 4 sections and numerous landowners that own land around those sections. Let's say that we decide to move this corner because of new technology we have. We decide that the corner is off by, let's say, 100 feet. We move it. Well, this moves everybody's property lines. Some will gain property, others will lose property. And we talked about in the first real lecture, we talked about the fact that boundaries are very important to people. Do you think people are going to be happy about you moving their boundaries, even though you say, well, it's more accurate now? No, that's not going to be an important thing. So we don't want to change, we don't have authority to change anything about a survey. We're just gathering evidence. That's our purpose, that's our goal, is to gather and show evidence. Here's a violation of Principle 5, and this was found, this is the one in Kemper County that I showed you previously. I'm going to tell you what it appears to be. I wasn't there when these were placed in the ground, so I'm just going to tell you what it appears to be. The concrete monument, I have found other monuments exactly like this in Kemper County at section corners. And this is a section corner. This was along a fence. The tree root that you see there in front of you had fence running through the tree. And on the ground you had a concrete monument set that I knew was a concrete monument that was used for section corners in Kemper County. And then right next to it, less than 6 inches away, you have a iron rod. Well, either evidence wasn't procured enough to determine the fact that there was something there. In other words, the concrete monument was covered up with a limb or leaves. And the surveyor that came through just put an iron pin in the ground where they thought it should be. Or they found the concrete monument and still placed a pin in the ground where they thought the section corner should be. This is a big violation. You don't do this. This is not something that you want to go out and start doing, because what you're saying is you're saying the original survey needs to be changed. And even if we alter it by just a few inches here, this can have drastic changes on people's land. And so we don't want to do this. This is a violation of that principle where you do not have the legal authority to put anything in the ground to change a corner. In the manual surveying instructions, which you can click on this link and go to it, section 6.1 through 6.8 describes the tiers of surveys and how they apply to each surveyor. When we get to talk about the GLO surveys later on in this semester, we'll talk more about original surveys, resurveys, independent and dependent, and then retracements. We'll talk more about those then. I have a new copy of the manual of surveying instructions that we'll go through. I'll also give some sightings from it so that you can have some information from it. But really that covers the original surveyors and their role, and what these other surveys are. What are resurveys? When are they conducted? I also have some information from a federal surveying friend of mine that we're going to use in this class as well to help us understand the difference between retracements and resurveys. And then boundary principle number 7. This applies to us today because of the tremendous increases in technology over the past several years. You know, current GPS technology can reach accuracy levels of a centimeter and a precision of a hundredth of a centimeter, which is insane. Former surveys that are retraced cannot be surveyed at this precision because the instruments that were being used at the time. Even if we go back 20 years, the technology we had 20 years ago is not anywhere as precise as what we have today. But precision does not necessarily ensure accuracy, and I really want you to understand that. We must use common sense when we're out surveying and we're obtaining measurements. That's really the point. Use some common sense behind what you're doing. Don't just follow the technology blindly, but use some common sense. Since older survey boundaries control, and we'll learn more about that as we talk about legal junior and senior rights, the measurement should reflect nearly what a former surveyor recorded. So we should be recording nearly what someone else recorded, but you're not looking for a precision, nor are you going to come in and say that you did a better job than the previous surveyor because of the accuracy of your technology. Because once again, remember that phrase out of the book from chapter 1, just because we have a lot of cool technology, we have Google Maps, we have GIS, does not necessarily mean that has it changes anything about former surveys that were conducted. You need to remember that. Alright, there was an extra slide in here, I think, on your slides, and I found it. Disregard that slide. It's the next to the last one. For the next week, we're going to have Chapter 3. I want you to read that in your textbook about ownership, transfer, and description of real property. We're also going to have a set of slides on that, and then Quiz 3 will also be posted on Monday of next week. Hope you all have a great week, and we hope to hear from you soon.